Hello and welcome to this Photoshop tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at creating a fantasy style image from this particular image here. So we're going to start with this is the back plate or main image, and we're going to finish with this. So we'll be using a few different techniques, and you can see these from over here in the layers panel on the right hand side. So we'll be looking at using different layers from different images and importing them into the main image. We'll be looking at using smart objects and also the types of edits and blending modes in Photoshop. So let's get started. I'm just going to close down this one, and then you can see here we have 3 other images that we're going to import into our backplate to create the final image. So first I'm going to start off by importing the mushroom. So normally the way I would do this is that I kind of start first the background, so we have the black plate here, so use that as the main canvas, and then stack up the images as the order they appear in the images we're viewing it. So in next kind of, or as part of the background, is obviously going to be this toadstool, which you can see I already have selected here. I'm going to just deselect and we'll look at selecting that. Just one note, most of these images are quite low resolution, so normally I would work with kind of higher resolutions, but just for tutorials it's easier to work with lower resolution images because everything just moves quicker and because it takes up less memory. But let's start by selecting this mushroom. So we're going to use the selection tools over here, and there's a number of different ones you can try. There's the object selection tool, which is pretty new. It was has been recently introduced into Photoshop CC, but if you're using earlier versions of Photoshop, for sure you'll have this quick selection tool, which has been around now for a little while. So we're going to start by selecting the quick selection tool from the toolbar on the left, and then making sure that we have add to selection enabled here at the top in the tool properties. And this is a brush based tool, so we just simply click and hold our mouse button and move around within the object that we want selected. So we want to make sure that the entire mushroom then has this, what I sometimes know called marching ants around it, which denotes that the object is selected. So this should be a pretty quick part with this tool, and one kind of helpful aspect of that is the fact that the background is a little bit blurred out, so it makes it easier for the tool to know where the edges are. Okay, so once you're pretty sure you have this selected, we don't need the very bottom of it because some of that's going to be hidden behind the grass in the image that we're using. So I'm going to next all go to select and mask. So we want to make sure that we have a nice clean selection, that it looks realistic in the image that we're importing it into. And to do that we can use some of these tools in the select and mask. So first of all, we could start by doing edge detection. So set the radius to 2, and we can turn on smart radius if we want. So that gives it a kind of an area of within 2 pixels where it can detect the edge better. We can smooth it out a little bit just to make it integrate with the image. Add a tiny bit of feathering. You don't want to add too much feathering because that will make it not look realistic when we import it. So I've added about 0.6 of a pixel. And then if you need to add, you can add a little bit of contrast back to the object. And then we don't need to shift the edge, but that will either grow or decrease the size of the selection, but we don't need that in this case. So once that's ready, then we can go ahead and click on OK. So we refined our selection, and now it's ready to be imported into our background, our canvas image, our backplate. So to do that, I'll use the move tool, which you find over here, or it's V is the shortcut on the keyboard. So I press V, and then I click inside the mushroom hold the mouse button. I don't release the mouse button, I hold it down and I move to the tab of the image that we're working with, and then I release the mouse button once I'm over the image that I'm working with. So now we have the image of the mushroom in here, and there's a few things that we need to do with it. First of all, I'm going to just flip it horizontally because I want the light is coming from this direction now with the mushroom, but in this image we want it coming from this direction. So I'll just go to Edit, Transform and Flip horizontally. Then the next thing I want to do is kind of roughly place it and then resize it, which I can do by going to Edit, Free Transform, or you have Control T is the shortcut. So I do Control T and I can resize it. Now if you want to resize it proportionately, that you don't want the width and the height to change, so it becomes either stretched or squashed in some way, you can just hold down the Shift key while using one of the corner boxes to resize it, and this will make sure that it resizes proportionately. So we're going to use it about that size, and then let's see, we'll position it about here. And then once we're happy with that, I'm going to hit Enter on the keyboard, or you can click on the tick at the top here. But Enter is just a little bit quicker. So next of all, we want to integrate the mushroom so it looks like it's inside this grass. So for that, we're going to use a mask. So a mask would help to show some of the background. So it masks out the part of the mushroom, so it becomes transparent and we end up seeing the grass in the background. So to do that, we're going to go to the layer panel over here on the right. If you can't find your layer panel, you always find it underneath the window menu and layers. So I'm going to add a layer mask by coming down here, and you've got a little rectangle with a circle in the center, and click on that, and that will add a layer mask. And what we want to start doing is we want to start hiding parts of that, and we need to paint on the layer mask, so make sure it's selected. If you see this little selection indicator here around the main layer, the masking won't work, so you need to make sure the actual mask is selected as it is now. So now I'm going to select a brush, so I'm going to go B on the keyboard for brush, select my brush tool, and I want to select a grass brush. Now by default, certainly in Photoshop 2021, they no longer show you the grass brushes, so you need to normally go to your brush settings at the top here, click on the little cog and click on legacy brushes, and that will load the legacy brushes. And then you'll find here in this list, you'll find right at the bottom, you'll find legacy brushes, and then if you scroll down you will find the one called grass, which we have here, which is a group, or we get dune grass, which is the separate ones. So we're going to use this grass one. So with grass selected now, I'm going to close this down. My brush size is a little bit too small at the moment, so I'm just going to increase that a little bit. And from here then, I need to go to the brush properties, which you find over here. If you can't find them there, again, go to Window and go to Brush Settings. So this defines how the brush is applied when I start to paint on the layer mask. So there's something particular here in this situation that we don't want, and that's the scattering effect. So I want to disable scattering, so it doesn't scatter. So I want to control where it goes. If you have scatter, it will randomly apply the brush to different parts of the image. So we want to turn scattering off. Underneath shape dynamics, you can change how big or small it gets every time you apply the brush. So we can use the default was 3, so that's fine. You can also apply an angle jitter, which means it'll change the angle slightly every time you press it. So it's by default it was on 10, which is quite okay. Also the roundness jitter and the minimum roundness are both quite okay in this case. So I'm going to close this down now, and we can start applying the mask to the bottom of this. Before you start applying the mask though, make sure your foreground color is black. If it's not black, you can set it easily to black by pressing D on the keyboard, which sets the foreground color to white and the background color to black, and then you can press X, which switches foreground with background. So now I have black in my foreground, and I can just start applying this. And you can see the maximum size now is maybe a little bit too big, so I'm going to go back to my shape dynamics underneath the brush settings, and I'm going to maybe just reduce this down to 2% and just decrease that brush size down a little bit again. And now that seems okay. So I'm just kind of starting to click in here and start to kind of build up the mask. It can take a while just to get the necessary effect. You can always zoom in a little bit as well, so Control plus and Control minus to zoom in and zoom out. So we've now added our grass. You can also try using other brushes as well. So for instance, I've downloaded some grass brushes here, which I've loaded into the brushes folder, and you can do that by just simply going to the brush settings, going to your brush properties, and then going to import brushes. And these ones I've downloaded earlier from various websites, and these are much more high resolution also, so you can also make use of these as well, which can just help in making it look a little bit more realistic. So I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe I'm just going to add well, let's just see how it looks at 100%. Yeah, well, I think that looks okay, so we'll leave that there. So the next thing that you want to import is what we're going to use as the fairy character here. I'm going to close this one down because we no longer need it. So we're going to import this one. So just in terms of making a selection, it's always good to try and find these elements that are being placed on a white background. So it just makes it much easier for us to select the objects, to import them. Just before I do that, I'm just going to give this a name. So I'm going to call this what it is. So it's commonly called Toadstool. So I know what's on each layer. So that's a good thing to do when you're using multiple layers in Photoshop. So next I'm going to import this, but first again I need to make a selection. So I'm going to click on the quick select tool and just start selecting this. It's also a good idea, if you can, and if that's available to you, to select a little bit of the shadow as well, because we can also use that in our image to integrate this a little bit better with the background image that we're using. So if I want to remove from the selection, I can hold down the Alt key. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to take or import these feathers in, so that's quite alright. So now we can just go to our select and mask. So I'm just going to go Control 0 so we can see 100%. So it just probably makes sense in this case to go to View and change it to a black background, so we can kind of make sure that we're getting a good accurate selection. Maybe turn our opacity down a little bit more, and we want to have a look. You can always use the refine here option here, so this will give you a better selection with here when you're selecting people. In this case it brings in these feathers, which I didn't want, so I'm not going to use the refine here option. So again, I'm going to use this radius option, smart radius. I'm going to smooth my selection a little bit and feather it. Add back a little contrast and maybe just a slight reduction in the shift edge, just so I eliminate those kind of white edges that are there. And then OK. And again, I'm going to use my move tool, Control V on the keyboard, and then import in the same way as I did with the previous one. And now we have this. Of course, it's much too big at the moment, so we need to resize it. So Control T and hold Shift while resizing to make it proportionate. So we just want to make sure that this person or fits on the toadstool, and then we also want to flip so they're looking at this little girl handing them the flower. So I go to Edit, Transform, and flip horizontally. So that seems quite good enough. Control plus then if I want to zoom in. And what we can do now is we can actually, because maybe our shadow isn't working quite so well there, and these blending modes won't work so great on the main image, but we can just create a copy of this. So I can create a copy of that image and place it in the background and call it Fairy Shadow 1, and then we can apply a more appropriate blending mode to it, so it adds a nice shadow for us. So it's just a matter of finding one that works nicely. Of course, it's handy if I actually turn off this on multiply. Looks pretty good. Overlay, maybe not strong enough. So we'll try using this one, and then we'll add a mask to our fairy. So I call this layer fairy, so everybody knows what we're working on. We'll add a mask, and I'm going to zoom in. And now I'm going to use the brush tool, make sure my mask is selected with the color black. I'm going to change my brush to one of the general brushes, just a soft round brush. Can maybe increase the hardness a little bit, decrease the size. You can also use your square bracket keys. You can also use square bracket keys to change that, and then I can just remove this kind of extraneous detail here that was along the edge, and you can see the shadow that we imported from the other images is available, and it just makes it look a little bit more realistic in that it appears to be there. And then in the actual fairy image we can also add a mask, because we don't need, some of the detail is affecting the fringes of the rest of the image, so we can just mask that out. So just run along the edges here and mask out anything, so it's not going to affect those edges. So now it's only affecting the shadow at the bottom. Okay, that's okay for the moment. We'll add a little bit more shadow to the other side of the mushroom in a moment. But this is okay for something to work with. So the next thing we want to introduce are the wings. So I'm going to close this, we're finished with this. And we're going to add the fairy wings. Again, these are from an image with a white background, so again it makes it quite easy for us to select them. Of course, a lot of the wing will be behind the fairy's back, so we don't need all the details. I'm going to also leave the ribbons out. So just let me zoom in a little bit here. Again, like I said, this is a low resolution image, but it's normally better to work with high resolution ones. But in the case of this tutorial, it's just easier to work with a low resolution one. And again, V on the keyboard. Before we actually do that, of course, I forgot to add our masking. So just to get the edge a little bit smoother, let's just do our smart radius again, feathering, a little bit of contrast, and then shift the edges to make sure none of that white is going to show up when we import them, and OK. So V on the keyboard, and then click, drag to the tab of the other image, and then release over. So we just want to make sure the layer order is correct. So at the moment these wings are showing up in front of the mushroom, which is not what we want, so we want them all the way to the back, like so. And we need to position them now correctly. So I'm going to do Control T, and we're going to rotate. So if I have the cursor outside the box, I can rotate these slightly just to make them line up a little bit nicer. Also going to reduce the size of them, so holding shift and grabbing the corner point and reducing the size. And that looks good. So I'm just going to actually take the fairy and the shadow so that they move together, move a little bit further back on this, and then the wings, which I'll name wings, this layer a little bit further back up, so it looks realistic that the wings are hanging behind the toadstool. And again, with these, it is also useful that these are going to be, obviously their wings are going to be a little bit transparent, so we can always reduce their opacity. You can also reduce the fill as well. Can also try some different blending modes to see if it might make it look a little bit better. So what have we got? So I was quite fond of this darken, but I'm going to create a duplicate of this layer on top of it, and then so multiply works quite nicely, and then just have a normal and reduce the opacity of this just to maintain the strength of the wings. And then we can add this in a group by selecting both wings using shift and click, and then Control G, we can group them together and call them wings. So just that's good housekeeping. So yeah, I think that looks quite okay now. So now we have our fairy and we have our toadstool. We just need to do a little bit more work on integrating them to make them look a little bit more realistic. So the first thing we want to do maybe is we'll add the glow to this flower, which we'll do through a new layer and a brush. So we'll just create a blank layer. Go into the layer panel and just create new layer. So now we have a blank layer, and I want to use a brush with a star shape. Can also do a search in the brushes too. So we've got a few different stars here. So let's have a look. Perhaps this one is maybe not quite what we're looking for. So this is probably slightly better. So we're going to use this as the basis for what we're going to do. We're just going to use the color white initially. So first of all, on the layer, I'm going to change my colors to white. So I'm just going to hit D on the keyboard to change to a black foreground, white background, and then hit X to bring white to the foreground, and then just check my brush settings. I've got opacity, flow 100%, which is fine. And then I get this, and I can just click on it a few times to get it a little bit stronger. Okay, so this brush is quite for a low resolution, so you can see it's breaking up here a bit, but that's quite okay because we're going to add a blur to it. So in order to add the blur to it, we're going to first of all make it a smart object by going to filter, convert for smart filters. Just get a warning message here. You can click OK here. Now you can see this icon over the layer indicating that it's a smart filter. And then from here we go to back to the filter menu and go to blur, and we'll add a Gaussian blur to it. And you can kind of check what works well. So that looks about okay. So yeah, so we no longer have a problem with the jagged edges. Okay, so in top of the Gaussian blur, then we're also going to add an effect to it. So we can look at adding an outer glow just to get it glowing a little bit more. So the best thing to do with these is you just often have to just experiment a little bit until you get exactly kind of what you want. So the range, the jitter of the range, so how consistent that is. The spread you can increase. Obviously we don't want something like this, so spread is left like that. It can be soft or precise, but soft is much better in this case. The size of the spread, so that can just blur the edges of the glow a little bit. You can add it as a gradient, so at the moment it's a consistent color, or we can have it that it is gradiated. And if you wish to, you can add a little bit of noise to it. And then the opacity will obviously add a strength to it. So that looks okay, that's quite okay. So we'll leave it like this, and we can also decrease the overall opacity if we want to a little bit later, if we wish so. So the next thing we want to do is then just fix the issue of the shadow here. So we want to get a shadow cast on this side of the mushroom a little bit better. So for that we can go to our Toadstool, and we can, in order to do this, we'll just use the round brush. So we'll go back up to the brushes, and we'll select the regular round brush, or general brushes, and the soft brush, and the size we can just reduce. So the size, and that's about okay. And then in order to make sure we're only affecting the area of the mushroom, we can just do Control click on the mushroom layer, to activate that area, so it's only going to where we paint will only affect the mushroom. And what we can do is I'm just going to do X, so we have black as our foreground color, and make sure you create a blank layer. And I can call this Fairy Shadow 2. And then we can deselect, and we can add a mask to this, clicking here, and then using the color black. Well, that's a bit too harsh, so what we can do here is turn our hardness down to 0, increase our brush size, just to try and soften the shadow up a little bit, and then we're also going to change the opacity of it slightly and the shape of it. So, and then obviously the shadow should be diminishing as it comes away. So for me that looks okay. That will certainly do. It's also possible that you could use a blending mode here to integrate the shadow a little bit better with the image, but if we use multiply and then check before and after, there's no real difference, so we don't need to use the blending mode in this case. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to add a shadow underneath the mushroom to make it look like it's actually there. So we've done the integration with the grass, but we want to add a little bit of shadow here. So in order to do that, then we need to create another layer, but underneath the toadstool. So select the wings group and just create a blank layer, and just actually drag that up so we make sure it's underneath the toadstool and not in the wings group. And then we can just use black, and we can use a shape for this. So we can use the elliptical selection tool, and we can draw out a shape that's kind of roughly like the same shape as the underneath of the mushroom, and then we can fill that with black. So we come down here and we get the paint bucket, which you find here, and we can paint black on that layer. And then I'm just going to redo that, and then Control D to deselect, and then we just need to integrate this shadow a little bit better. So we're going to use the filters again, so convert for smart objects, and OK, and then we can go to filter, blur, and back to Gaussian blur again, and we'll just soften out the edges of this. That's about okay. And also we can reduce the opacity a little bit, and you can even try a blending mode here, because it makes it a little bit easier to see the grass. I'm also going to just, where we did the grass here, so this has gone black, and this is meant to be in front of the mushroom, so this is causing maybe a little issue. So we can just try and go to the toadstool layer and just get that, and apply this to the mask for this shadow. So we have here, we don't have a mask here yet, but when I create one, then that should apply that there, and then we can just paint this part back in, but I didn't want this grass too affected by it. But we can now use the brush, reduce the brush to about 20%, which I've done here by hitting 2 on the keyboard, and then we can simply paint that back in, hit X so it's white, and then paint it back in like that, so it looks a little bit more realistic. If you want to add a further level of realism, we can add a displacement map for this. Now I cover in another tutorial, I cover how to create displacement maps, so I won't do it here. I already have a displacement map created for this. So in order to apply it to this layer, then I would have to go to the filter, distort, and displace, and we can just use these. This is a smart object, so we can go back and change these settings if they don't work for the for this particular setting, and it embeds the file in the smart object data. So we hit OK. So here's our displacement map. So I select that, open, and then it applies the displacement map. So you can just see before and after. So what that does is it just makes it look more realistic. It adjusts the shadow to the texture of the grass that was in the background to give it a little bit more of a realistic look. And again, I said I cover how to create the displacement map in another tutorial, which I can put up below here, and you see appearing on a card. So now we're at the point where we're almost finished, so we just need to add a few more effects to get it to look a little bit more realistic. So one effect that we can add is that we can add a layer to add a kind of overall noise to the image. So in order to do that, we just create a blank layer, and then what we do is we can fill it with a solid color. So I can just go here to edit, fill, and we're just going to use 50% gray, and then OK, and then I'm going to add a grain to that by going to the filter menu. But first I'm going to make it into a smart object. So filter, convert for smart filters, and then go to noise, and we're just adding noise. So we want to add it as a monochromatic noise, so we don't want any color in it. And you can either choose Gaussian or uniform. So I'm going to choose Gaussian here. The amount you can change, so if we want a little bit less, maybe we use 8%, and then we click on OK, and then we just need to change this blending mode. So we need to go to an overlay for this one, and you can see that's quite noisy now, so we can actually just reduce the opacity of the layer down to about 70, and we have a nice overall noise on the image. And of course we can always change that as well by going back into the noise settings there. That is all, that information is all saved. So that just gives a little bit of a better overall integration with the image, and it makes the elements kind of look as if they belong. We can also add a kind of a color tint, so in an adjustment layer, so I can use photo filter to add a nice tint to the image. So at the moment now it defaults to this warming filter, so you can have a cooling filter if you want to give it an overall cool look, just to make sure that everything fits in nicely together. So we'll go with the cooling look. And we can also add the levels there, so just to get our contrast a little bit better. And there we have our final image. Okay, so thank you for watching this tutorial.